right. Welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science, hosted by the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love, and I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce you to postdoctoral scholar Rose Trappist, coming from the University of Bergen. Before I turn things over to her and her presentation, I just want to highlight the aims and goals of this program, which began as a part of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were unable to travel, and it especially affected those who were emerging scholars and their ability to network and let others know about their scholarship. And after the pandemic began to fade into the background, we realized that this kind of opportunity continued to be valuable to the philosophy of science community around the world. And so we've continued to showcase virtual research presentations from international scholars with commentators from local MCPS, that's Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science community members. So our speaker for today is Rose Trappist, coming to us from the Center for the Study of the Sciences and the Humanities at the University of Bergen in Norway. Her presentation is Citizen Science Exploitative? And just a word of procedure for those who are joining us. After Rose makes her presentation, I will introduce the commentator, Emily Snell-Rude, who will then offer comments, followed by a time for Rose to respond briefly to those comments before we open it up broadly for Q&A. And when that comes, I'll say a little bit more about that. But if you are preparing questions, know that there will be that time period after the presentation during the commentary where you could be formulating your questions for Rose. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Rose.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alan. So I'll just share my presentation and get this out of the way. Okay. So thank you, Alan, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here today. It's really great that this is still going, this online International Postdoc Forum. I think it's a really great opportunity, and I'm looking forward to being able to speak to you, even if it means that I'm it's 7 p.m. here, so I've managed to have an early dinner, and I'm hopefully awake enough and on the ball enough to give this presentation. So this is work in progress that I'm developing out of some work that I've been doing looking at citizen science, specifically now focusing on the issue of exploitation in citizen science. And I did want to start with a brief content warning. I will, in this presentation, be mentioning, though not really thematizing at any great length, some topics that some people might find disturbing or upsetting, including slavery and sexual exploitation. So I'll keep the mentions to a minimum, but I did want to flag that that's kind of going to be being mentioned. So with that out of the way, back to citizen science. So citizen science has been receiving a lot of attention over the last 10 to 15 years. And in particular, science policymakers, governments, and universities have been pushing for scientists to engage in more citizen science. This is an example from the European Commission's open science policy. So many of these pushes for citizen science fall under the banner of open science. This is an example from the Research Council of Norway, where citizen science is quite prominent right at the start of their policy for open science. And this is the policy from the University of Bergen, where I'm based, where, again, they mention citizen science quite prominently in the policy. So lots of people wanting scientists to do more citizen science, wanting there to be more citizen science, which raises the important question of whether citizen science is actually ethical to be doing and what the potential harms and problems of citizen science might be. Fortunately, people have been considering this for quite some time already. So people like, some of you might be familiar with Kevin Elliott, but quite a range of scholars in ethics and philosophy of science, as well as in citizen science itself, have been thinking about the ethics of citizen science. And one of the issues that often comes up in this literature, and in particular is pointed out in these two papers on the slide, is exploitation and the risk of exploitation in citizen science. So this is the topic that I'll be focusing on today. And I should note that it's an ethical concern, but it's also a political concern. And I'll be drawing on literature from political philosophy, understood fairly broadly, to look at and make sense of exploitation in citizen science. So citizen science, or as it's sometimes known, for instance, more recently in the US, participatory science, it uses the labor and expertise of volunteers to serve the needs and interests of professional scientists. You've got lots of people out there doing a lot of hard work for scientists in the end. And it's this sort of structure that raises the question of whether citizen science is exploitative. It looks a little like it might be risking some sort of exploitation. So that's what I'm asking in this presentation. Is citizen science exploitative? And also, what should we do if it is? So I'll start by delving into a little bit more detail, looking at how people have discussed the problem of exploitation in citizen science. And I'll also introduce the notion of epistemic exploitation from the literature in social epistemology as a special sort of exploitation that might be going on in citizen science. Then I'll zoom out a little bit and look at what exploitation is more generally. And this will help to both better understand exploitation as it might be happening in citizen science, but also to recharacterize epistemic exploitation a little bit more broadly. Then I'll return to thinking about the problem of exploitation in citizen science and when and under what conditions citizen exploitation crops up in citizen science. And I'll conclude by suggesting some kind of vague measures for how to avoid and address problems of exploitation in citizen science. So in this presentation, the way I'm using this term, citizen science, is to pick out this crowdsourcing or contributory mode of participation in scientific research. So it's typically when members of the public are doing things like collecting data, collecting samples, contributing observations, or performing rudimentary analyses for professional scientists. And I will mostly use the term citizen science. This is a contested term, but it's the term that's most common in Europe, where I'm based, and also in many other parts of the world. So citizen science as an approach has become common in many different fields, from biology and ecology and environmental sciences, in fields like meteorology and astronomy, also in historical sciences such as archaeology and history. It's prominent in the health sciences, and basically everywhere you look, even physics, you can find examples of citizen science. This is one quite well-known example that I've been working with a bit, eBird, which is a birdwatching data platform developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in the US. And it allows birdwatchers to contribute their observations of birds to a public data set that's used by scientists around the world to study birds. This is a much smaller example of citizen science, ISOSCAN. It's a project based at the University of Bergen, where I work. And it kind of recruits hikers and skiers to collect water or snow samples that they then send back to be analyzed for isotopes to do some complicated meteorology and climate science stuff. I don't know, complicated science, let's put it this way. So this is the sort of citizen science projects that we're talking about here. And these sorts of projects are valued for their epistemic benefits. They often allow researchers to gather larger sample sizes have a greater analytic capacity, and to get a broader spatiotemporal scope, and so on. There's also a range of other benefits that citizen science promise, such as improving scientific literacy in the public, increasing public trust in science, increasing democratization of science, and so on. So although there's these recognized benefits, or at least promised benefits of citizen science, there's also been some concerns, as I mentioned, about the risk of exploitation in citizen science. And these concerns can be roughly grouped into two matters. On the one hand, the fact that there's a lot of labor going into this practice that's not adequately remunerated. So people are doing free labor, they're not being paid for the work that they're doing. The second concern is a lack of informed and free consent. So to start with the first one, here's a quote from Lisa Rasmussen, who was one of the authors who wrote this general article about ethics in citizen science. And Rasmussen writes, community members may carry air sampling machines around the community, gather water samples from a stream, or test levels of soil contamination. Often, they're not compensated for this work. Yet traditional researchers performing the same activities both are compensated for time spent on research and receive other credit, both material and non-material, for discoveries, publications, and so on, resulting from the work. Here's another couple of authors making a very similar point, this time talking about some different examples. So they write, if a researcher asks citizen scientists to complete a task like mapping galaxies and convinces the public to do it because it is a privilege to participate in scientific discovery, will the participants feel tricked when they see the researcher get publications and prestige on the backs of their effort, while they have received only the privilege of contributing their labor? So you can see again this idea that this is unremunerated labor going into this practice. And yes, maybe they get the reward of the privilege of contributing their labor, but that's really not a reward at all, and certainly not payment for the work they're doing. And in even slightly more polemical tone, Mirofsky writes, citizen scientists are being lured to contribute sporadic, unremunerated labor to some massive online assembly line to generate process data. So you can see the concern here. People are being called on to do labor for scientists, and they're not being paid for that labor. The second concern is slightly different. Here, it's not about the fact that people aren't being paid, but rather about the fact that they're not actually consenting to this practice, so that the practice is coercive in some way. So this is a quote from that paper by Resnick Elliott and the other author whose name I forget, about the ethics of citizen science. And they write that another concern regarding exploitation is the potential for citizens, scientists, or the wider public to be misled about the nature of citizen involvement in particular research projects. For example, they write, lay people may volunteer for a research project, expecting to have a significant influence on the research design, but subsequently find that their role is primarily just to help collect data. So this sort of misleading information means that if people have agreed to participate in a project based on an idea about what's going to be involved that turns out not to be true, they haven't actually properly consented to participating in that project in the first place. And potentially there's been kind of a misleading use of promises about what they'll be doing in the project that on which they base their consent, in fact. So sort of coercive practice. Similarly, other authors point out that there's often misleading or no information about the benefits that participants will receive, including how credit will be distributed, and also about how demographic information will be used. In addition to these concerns about the lack of adequate information, there's also concerns about kind of the freedom with which participants are agreeing to participate. And Reicheld and Gay talk about the use of citizen science as part of school assignments at school or in universities. And they note that if students aren't given another way to earn credits for those activities, these students are being coerced. They're being forced to engage in citizen science. Similarly, they point out that there's often a requirement to share data in order to participate in aspects of the citizen science kind of world, such as online discussion boards about the project. And there's also quite a lot of design that goes into the platforms on which citizen science is hosted that kind of push people to participate and to participate more. And this doesn't necessarily amount to coercion, but there can be practices that kind of head in the direction of not giving people a fully free choice in terms of whether and how much they want to participate. So those are the two concerns: lack of adequate remuneration and a lack of informed and free consent. And why these are concerns about exploitation is that coerced and unremunerated labor is a paradigm case of exploitation. And here slavery is the obvious example. So that's exploitation in general, but I did want to highlight also a more specific sort of exploitation, namely epistemic exploitation. So together with some colleagues, I've been part of a reading group looking at literature surrounding the topic of epistemic diversity, often drawing on social epistemology. And one of the concepts that we've encountered in this reading group is that of epistemic exploitation. So we're getting a lot of concepts through this reading group. We've been building a map, which you can see on the slide there. It's still kind of a prototype, but we're kind of drawing connections between concepts that are found in the literature, identifying definitions or characterizations, seeing how concepts are linked, and so on. So epistemic exploitation is a concept that was first coined, at least to our knowledge, by Berenstain in 2016, referring to instances in which oppressors, people who are privileged, where they extract testimony about oppression from people who are themselves oppressed for the benefit of learning about oppression. So Berenstain talks about this in terms of oppressors making a well-intentioned effort to learn. So this is exploitative, it's extracting testimony in order to benefit the oppressor themselves, and often then to the disbenefit of the person that has to go to the effort to explain again what it is to be oppressed. So this concept, as we've been figuring out in our map, it's related to several other relatively well-known but also relatively new concepts in social epistemology, such as epistemic oppression, epistemic injustice, diversity free writing, epistemic extractivism, and extracted speech. So there's, since Berenstein's definition, there's been several other similar but also slightly different characterizations of epistemic exploitation. You can see, for instance, Gail Polhouse has proposed two different ways to think about what epistemic exploitation is. And in particular, these definitions suggest a link to or an application to citizen science. So for instance, the idea that epistemic exploitation occurs when epistemic labor is coercively extracted from epistemic agents in the service of others. That sounds quite like what was going on in the case of citizen science, where people are doing this epistemic labor, collecting data or samples or performing analyses for the benefits in the service of professional scientists. And this element of coercion is at play as well, because people aren't being adequately informed about what they're doing, and they may even be kind of not given a full choice in terms of their participation. So again, coming back to this idea of exploitation, the concern about exploitation in citizen science, we have coerced unremunerated labor is paradigmatic for exploitation, but also specifically for epistemic exploitation. So based on these ideas and these discussions about exploitation, we might think, So we just have to ensure that participants are well informed, that they choose freely to participate, and that they receive something in return for their work. And by doing these three things, we'll make sure that citizen science isn't exploitative. As you can probably tell by the fact that I'm only 20 minutes into this presentation, that's not the answer to that question is not yes, essentially. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And to understand why, we need to look at the literature on exploitation. So I did what many philosophers do. I went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and typed in exploitation, and there's a really great article in there about that. But also, as somebody with a background in feminist philosophy, I had already been reading and was already familiar with Iris Marion Young's work on oppression and in particular on exploitation. So both of these have informed what's going to come up, and I've also been drawing on some other resources. So in that Stanford Encyclopedia article, they kind of set out right at the beginning a kind of a rough intuitive idea about what exploitation is. They write, to exploit someone is to take unfair advantage of them. It is to use another person's vulnerability for one's own benefit. And it's important to note here that some cases of exploitation are harmful and non-consensual, such as slavery, as I mentioned before. But you'll notice in that characterization above, in the first point, there's no mention there of things being non-consensual or harmful. And that's because there's quite a few cases of exploitation that are neither harmful nor non-consensual. So a lot of the literature on exploitation in the last 20 years or so, maybe even longer, 30 years, or even 40, time goes fast. So a lot of the literature has been about cases of exploitation that are both mutually advantageous and consensual. So in which both parties consent to and receive some benefit from a transaction, but nevertheless, the transaction is still exploitative. So some examples here that have been discussed in the literature as kind of like standard cases. The first is that of somebody who's dying of thirst in a desert, and they agreed to pay $1,000, the exorbitant price of 1,000, let's say, Australian dollars, for a bottle of water. And obviously this person's going to benefit from the water and they're consenting to pay for that water, but it's still an exploitative price for somebody to charge this person. Another example that gets discussed quite often is that of housewives in particular, kind of back in the day, consenting to and also then benefiting materially and socially from their marriages, but still being subjected to exploitation within those marriages, exploitation including being exploited for their care work, but also for sexual labor and emotional labor. And finally, an example that gets discussed at great length is that of sweatshop workers. And this has been in particular a discussion since the late 90s. And here, the idea is that you have a lot of laborers who are consenting to and also benefiting from the employment conditions that they're offered, but these employment conditions are they still constitute exploitation. They're still not receiving a full living wage, even if it's better than they would have been without the living wage, without the poor wage that they're receiving. So these sorts of examples and the recognition that there can be mutually advantageous and consensual exploitation have led to what's known as the paradox of exploitation. So this is Ruth Sample's kind of brief characterization of that paradox. She writes, if two persons agree to a transaction and the transaction makes both parties better off than they were before, then how can the transaction be wrong? The common sense answer seems to be that it cannot be wrong under these conditions. And yet, many putatively exploitative interactions seem to fit this description and seem to be seriously wrong, such as the examples that I had on the previous slide. This is at the heart of what has come to be known as the paradox of exploitation. And philosophers have kind of attempted to address this paradox by characterizing exploitation in a kind of a richer or deeper way. So they've been looking to ways to define or characterize exploitation that can account for these cases of mutually advantageous and consensual exploitation. And this is a rough list that I've come up with through a little bit of reading of kind of common characteristics that people have discussed of exploitation. And this is not a list of necessary and sufficient conditions, obviously. There's also a lot of interrelations between different items on the list. And in some cases, some people might want to lump one under the other and so on. And there's also disagreement in the literature about which are the kind of most important or relevant characteristics. But I'll go through each of them in turn, just so we can get an understanding of them. And that'll help us to then both think again about epistemic exploitation, but also then about citizen science. So to start with unfairness, exploitation typically involves the net benefits of an interaction not being fairly distributed amongst the parties, even if there is some mutual benefit. So you have, again, from that Stanford Encyclopedia article, the idea that exploitation doesn't necessarily harm its victim in the sense of making her worse off than she would have been had the exploiter never interacted with her at all. Think about, say, a sweatshop worker. They are still better off than they would have been if they hadn't been able to work in the sweatshop. Rather, exploitation makes its victim worse off than she should have been had she been treated fairly. And so it's this idea of fairness that they use to, or at least that some people use to draw the distinction between what's an exploitative relationship or interaction and what's not. Another characteristic of exploitation is the way in which it frequently involves and is involved in, kind of perpetuating relations of historical injustice, such as class, gender, or race-based oppression and domination. So you have, for instance, Iris Marion Young, when she's writing about exploitation, she writes that it's a matter of the labor and energy expenditure of one group benefiting another, and that reproduces a relation of domination between those groups. More recently, Miriam Muller writes that exploitation is a matter of taking advantage of another's vulnerability to bring about a transfer of resources, so that you end up perpetuating this power differential between people or groups. A third feature that often gets discussed is that of disrespect. So the idea being that exploitation may involve a lack of respect for the exploited party as an equal partner in a transaction. So you can see this is related to issues of fairness and also related to issues of historical injustice and domination, but it's slightly distinct. So Ruth Sample is a proponent of this view. She writes, in the case of sweatshop labor, the employer chooses to pay workers a lower wage than is compatible with meeting her basic needs or in conditions that are unduly dangerous or otherwise onerous. If an employer could interact with employees on terms that more adequately respect their intrinsic worth, but instead offers those employees less, then the employer has committed a moral injury. So not respecting the intrinsic worth of the people you're interacting with can be involved in exploitation. And finally, a lack of autonomy and agency. This characteristic is a little harder to identify. Kind of nobody's saying this fully straightforwardly, but for instance, if you look at Young's work, she points out that what's often involved in exploitation is menial labor. And menial labor, she writes, usually refers not only to service, but also to any servile, unskilled, low-paying work lacking in autonomy in which a person's subject to taking orders from many people. And I think this lack of autonomy and agency, this does actually help to pick out some of the things that we're concerned about with exploitation. So with those four features in mind and the recognition that there can be consensual and mutually advantageous exploitation, we can come back to epistemic exploitation briefly. And I think it's interesting to note that a lot of the discussions of epistemic exploitation have focused on coercive and unremunerated interactions. And here you can see it in this example from Polhouse quite explicitly. So I think it's worth adjusting definitions of epistemic exploitation to allow for these consensual and mutually advantageous forms of epistemic exploitation. And I think this actually captures some of the phenomena that people are interested in when they're looking at epistemic exploitation. So here's a first go at that. We can say that epistemic exploitation occurs when one party unfairly benefits from the epistemic labor of another, especially when the transaction or structure is based on relations of historical injustice or domination, and there's a lack of respect and autonomy or agency for the party providing the epistemic labor. For instance, when they're confined to a menial epistemic task, such as a description or data collection, rather than drawing inferences, developing hypotheses, and so on. And you can potentially see where I'm going there with the link to citizen science. So then, given this kind of broader understanding of exploitation and epistemic exploitation, we can return to the question, is citizen science exploitative? So we can say that even if participants are well informed, they choose freely to participate and they receive something in return for their work, citizen science can still be exploitative. We can't rule exploitation out at this stage. Instead, we need to check for the common characteristics of exploitation. So unfairness, historical injustices or domination, disrespect, lack of autonomy or agency. So to start with unfairness, it's worth pointing out to begin with that participants often do get something out of citizen science, and this is quite well recognized. I haven't put any literature on the slide, but there's lots of studies of this. So they often get a sense of doing something meaningful, of being a part of something bigger. It's often fun and enjoyable for participants. They might make new connections, develop a sense of community, and frequently, although not always, they learn about science, scientific knowledge, and scientific practices. It's also worth pointing out that professional scientists pay costs when they engage in citizen science. Citizen science, when it's done well, is extremely resource intensive, and the scientists I've spoke to have become very well aware of this. It's also worth pointing out that the data that's obtained from these kinds of projects often doesn't meet common standards, which means that it requires a lot more work on the side of scientists to make it useful and usable. So with those two things in mind, citizen scientists do benefit from their participation. Scientists also pay some costs. We need to kind of evaluate the costs and benefits and how they're distributed in an interaction in order to decide if it's fair or not. And this was already recognized by Resnick and colleagues. They wrote that mutually beneficial exploitation could occur in citizen science if lay volunteers or local communities do not receive a fair share of the benefits of research. So the idea is it's not just that they benefit at all, it's that they receive a fair share of the net benefits. In the case of epistemic exploitation, I think there's something interesting to be thinking about here about which sort of benefits we're talking about. And to me, it would make sense that the benefit should be primarily epistemic, although I'm not settled on this actually. But we might think that to be a fair epistemic exchange, the epistemic benefits should be fairly distributed. And this would entail that participants having fun or getting this sense that they're contributing to something bigger than themselves, that this isn't actually enough because that's not really an epistemic benefit. But again, I'm not fully settled on this, so this could be something we could discuss. So an example, going back to one of the examples I mentioned earlier, eBird. In this case, participants are providing a lot of epistemic resources to scientists, but they're also getting some epistemic resources in return. eBird is a very useful platform for birdwatchers to collect their data and to share their data and to learn about birds. And birdwatchers are kind of special in this sense that they really do care about collecting their lists and sharing them with others. So this is a great resource for them. question whether this makes it a fair epistemic exchange. I'm inclined to think maybe yes. A lot of work goes into providing this very useful tool, but it's important to think then about like exactly how these benefits are being balanced. Another example, going back to that case of ISOScan that I mentioned. So a master's student that I'm working with, she's looking into this project and looking at what participants gain from participating in ISOScan and whether there's reciprocity in the project. And she's been doing some interviews and kind of go along interviews with participants. And she's been finding that not all participants are actually motivated by the science, particularly, or at least not motivated to learn about the science. And we've also, in discussions with Harald Soderman, who's the kind of the PI of the project, been discussing how often this very complex science is very hard to communicate to participants while at the same time lowering barriers to participation. So the more you want to try and involve people in the complex side of the science, the less willing people are to say, yes, okay, I'll help you out with this. So when thinking about whether citizen science is exploitative, the question of unfairness requires a lot of detailed examination on a case-by-case basis, essentially. What about the other three characteristics? When it comes to historical injustices and domination, it's worth recognizing that there's a long history of power differentials between professional scientists and what are sometimes known as lay or amateur scientists, and both of those words already pick out a power differential. And often in history, but also still today, this has a gendered, classed, or racialized dimension. And so these systems, these structures can persist in, and can and do persist in citizen science, although people are trying to overcome and break down these barriers. In addition, sometimes citizen science extracts epistemic resources from the global south or marginalized communities to benefit professional scientists and privileged institutions in the global north. So there's this extractivist structure that, again, kind of plays on and reinforces structures of domination and power differences between actors and groups. This obviously doesn't apply for all citizen science projects, but it's present in quite some projects. The third characteristic was disrespect. And here I think it's interesting. So this is an article by people who are mostly scientists, in fact, and they talk about the way in which the professional scientists treat citizen scientists largely as equivalent to instruments. Like a scientific instrument, like a microscope or any other thing that they might be using. And this is a clear example of kind of not treating people with the respect that they would deserve as people, and rather than just treating them as instruments, as things. Although scientists might also have a lot of respect for their instruments. So. And finally, lack of autonomy or agency. Here, I think it's interesting to think about the way in which a lot of citizen science projects, they downplay the training aspect of things. They try to make things as simple as possible to try and improve the number of people who participate. But in the process, then they don't enable people to to acquire new skills and knowledge, and thereby enhance their ability to engage in scientific research. So this has been noted by several authors who've talked about the way that the kind of apprenticeship and training aspect has been conveniently banished, or the way in which enhancing citizens' self-efficacy and their knowledge might be promised, but not realized because of poor implementation. So to summarize, yes, sometimes citizen science is exploitative, and deciding when it is and under what conditions it is requires looking at cases and seeing how these characteristics apply. So in the last couple of minutes, just briefly, if citizen science is exploitative, if a particular case of citizen science is exploitative, what should we do about it? And here the we could be citizen science practitioners, so those who kind of do these projects, help them to exist. These could be policymakers, governments, scientists, and the participants themselves, of course. And some more pointed questions: should practitioners and scientists amend their projects to be less exploitative, and if so, how? Should science policymakers stop incentivizing exploitative citizen science? And should they prohibit or discourage it? And finally, should scientists avoid using open data coming from exploitative citizen science initiatives? A bit like people might boycott sweatshops. So I'm not going to answer these questions exactly, but I think there are several measures that could be put in place to try to avoid and address the risk of exploitation in citizen science. These are interrelated, and they're also very demanding. So the first is to ensure that there's a fair distribution of benefits. A second, to address rather than reinforce historical injustices and dismantle structures of domination and vulnerability. The third is treating participants with respect, and fourth, ensuring that they have autonomy and agency. So just briefly, Resnick and colleagues already kind of addressed the first sort of an issue. They talked about the fact that scientists need to offer citizens a fair share of the benefits, and what this fair share is depends on what they're being asked to do. But some of the benefits that they're talking about are ownership and intellectual property, authorship and formal recognition, education, enhanced capabilities, a sense of accomplishment and appreciation of the environment, but also financial benefits, money. It's also worth pointing out, and this isn't stressed so much in that article, that the disbenefits or harms, such as the burdens of participation, also should be fairly distributed. What about the other measures? Well, they're a little bit harder. So on the one hand, changing mode of citizen science from this crowdsourcing or contributory mode to a more collaborative or co-produced mode, this can help to ensure that there's a fair distribution of epistemic benefits. It can address historical injustices and disrupt structures of domination, and it can enable respect, autonomy, and provide the means to further develop agency. But this obviously would be changing the mode of citizen science. And so what about crowdsourcing citizen science? Is this just doomed to be exploitative? And I think here there's going to be some significant trade-offs. So I already mentioned this a little bit, but there's a question about how much autonomy participants are granted and how much agency they're kind of provided with in a project versus how easily scientists can make use of the data. And so some of the epistemic benefits of the data. There's also a trade-off between how active and educational the participation is made to be, a trade-off between that and actually getting a lot of people to participate. And I mentioned this in the case of ISOScan, where it's very complex science. The more you try and get people learning about that science, the less willing they are actually to do this, because they're not in for a science level. They just want a fun day out. So to wrap up, citizen science, to answer the question that I started with, it is, or at least it can be, epistemically exploitative. And this is due not to the fact that it's not only if it's, this is the case not only if it's coercive and people aren't getting any benefit at all, but in particular it occurs due to unfairness in the distribution of net benefits, due to it's linked to historical injustices and structures of domination. It's because of the disrespect, the lack of respect accorded to participants, and also the lack of autonomy or agency that participants are granted. Addressing these conditions, I argued, can help to avoid exploitation, but there are likely limitations for the case of contributory or crowdsourcing citizen science. And finally, various parties are in a position to address exploitation. And it's also a question there about whether there are duties to address exploitation in citizen science. And this is the discussion that's going on also with respect to exploitation more generally. What does it entail in terms of how we ought to be acting, actually? And it's a life debate. There's even some arguments to suggest that even if exploitation is taking place, we have no duty to intervene, and in fact, we ought not to intervene. So some of those measures that I was talking about, there's questions actually about whether they should be things that we ought to be thinking about at all. But I tend to think that most people would want to address exploitation in citizen science and try to avoid it where they can. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention. And thank you also to my collaborators who've been working with me on these various aspects of this project, and to people that I've been speaking to about citizen science. Yes, so that's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Rose. That was wonderful. So now I'd like to welcome our commentator, Emily Snell-Rude, to join us. And Emily is a associate professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior here at the University of Minnesota, and also a resident fellow of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. So Emily, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Alan. And I just want to start by saying, Rose, that was awesome. So many great points and really a lot of insights, and that was really great. So I only have a little bit to add, and so I'm very interested in the discussion that comes out of this. And I want to start by just saying I'm giving some thoughts both as a scientist here. So most of my work, which is using butterflies to look at how organisms deal with human environments, most of the work in my lab does not involve citizen science, but sometimes it does. So we have done some studies where we've asked for community members to help with the science. For instance, the study where we released a bunch of monarchs and we're trying to track them and see where they went depending on their treatment. And more recently, we've been doing a lot of, I would call it community engaged research rather than citizen science, but working as a scientist with partners in the community. So both thoughts as a scientist and also as a citizen scientist. So I've also participated as a participant in research projects, and this was one I participated in a few years ago, run through the University of Michigan. Again, a monarch tracking project, but here I was one of the people actually deploying sensors in my yard and sending data to the researchers every week. All right, so just a few thoughts. First, I agree with pretty much everything you said, Rose. Many great points. I see the concerns about exploitation in citizen science, and especially thinking about even if there's consent and it's mutually advantageous, thinking about, is it fair and how do we know it's fair and what do we do about that if it's not and if there's this potential. I think it's particularly important thinking about science where there are really time-intensive protocols or protocols that involve special equipment, and how much are you asking the people to do for you? That's a piece of this fairness calculation. But there's also an issue of equity and access to science. And this came up in the talk as well. But to extend it a little bit further with respect to citizen science, if there are benefits to participating in citizen science, not everyone can afford to give time or free labor to participate in citizen science. And this can be tied into the science itself. So just one example, a few months ago, I was talking with my Uber driver after a conference about how he spends almost all of his time just driving around, trying to make ends meet to feed his family. And someone like him, we were talking about the science at the meeting and he was interested in it, but he's not going to have time to raise butterflies in his backyard. He's just trying to feed his family. And there are obviously these links between socioeconomic status and this access to citizen science, this opportunity, but also that's going to affect the science because it's intertwined with the environment. So an example from some of our work in urban ecology, I'm involved in this long-term ecological research program in the Twin Cities, and one of the things we're thinking about is tree cover and how that affects, this is just in St. Paul, differences in tree cover that affects access to the benefits of living in different areas. So certain areas like Frogtown here is highlighted in red, has less of the benefits of shade. But so not only do they have less of the benefits, but they don't have time to be involved in citizen science. And that's a certain subset of the environment in the urban areas that you're not going to get access to because of these social inequities. So that it gets really complicated really fast. So a couple of additional thoughts in thinking about where it is a fair exchange and how we can maybe broaden our thinking about benefits, and how those benefits vary with the person. And this would then deal with what are we going to do about it if there are these risks of citizen science being exploitative. So Rose brought up this point of, a lot of people are doing citizen science because they just want to have fun. So in a lot of cases, people are engaging in projects that are aligned with something that they're already doing for fun. It's part of their hobby. And this usually makes the hobby even better because it adds purpose to something that you already love doing. And there's this emergent societal good that comes out of it being citizen science. And I'm just going to build on the eBird example that Rose gave. So I love birding. I've always loved birding. And one of my favorite things is to spend a day outside watching birds with friends. And then at the end of the day, sit down and come up with our list together. And that's fun in and of itself, making that list. But it has even more purpose and meaning and impact if you then upload that list to eBird, where it can contribute to not just other people knowing where to look for certain birds, but scientists making use of that data as well. And so that's a very little extra thing on my part that can have this much bigger emergent good. It's already part of the hobby. And this relates to a more general point that people often enjoy donating their time and money. And if you can do just a little bit extra on something that's already fun for you to give it extra purpose, that you usually get more enjoyment out of it. So we know people give money to charities. That generally makes people feel good, giving that money to something that they believe is a good cause. And in Googling cartoons for citizen science, I saw this one, which made me think to what extent are we now seeing science as almost a charity if it's under threat in terms of funding? And so does this mean that people feel even better giving their time and money to science through citizen science because it is under threat? And this is related to this. Sorry, this is just more like this commentary is just a list of my thoughts that I thought of in watching this talk. And so here I'll just mention briefly this broader literature on volunteering, money, and happiness. And Rose hinted at this in several of the points made in the talk. That there are these benefits to people participating in citizen science. It connects them to people, it makes them feel good. And we know in the volunteering literature that just participating in just volunteering itself generally makes people happier. And this is even when you control for the possibility that maybe happy people are more likely to volunteer. If you just look before and after, the act of participating in volunteering tends to improve people's well-being. And so this is related to another literature on money and happiness, because there's a whole lot of debate about generally money does not necessarily make us happy, even if we think that it does. And this is from another paper on the paradox of happiness, showing that in general, happiness does not increase as incomes rise over time and space, but in a slice of time, there is a correlation between happiness and income, and that's probably due to some degree of social comparison in that slice of space and time. So our well-being is related to money and compensation, but in a much more complicated way than it seems on the surface. So if we want to think about fairness and what people are getting out of participation in citizen science, yes, money might be important sometimes in terms of compensation, but not all the time. And so where is the middle ground? And this is kind of what I want to end on here, thinking about how do we, this is a really nuanced issue. What do we do with all of this in order to design a citizen science method that's more fair? So I think the first one, and this is something that Rose brought up in the talk, is consider what is being asked and how it compares to what an individual might want to be doing anyway for fun. And that's going to vary with that individual. And so to build on this, on some butterfly examples, there are already a lot of people that are raising butterflies for fun in their house. And so there are lots of ways citizen science can and already do tap into that to learn things at a broader scale. But how much are you asking them to do? Are you asking them to raise a couple individuals, release them, and give that information back? Or are you asking them to raise them in completely different treatments, which is going to be a whole lot of work and all of a sudden is not nearly as much fun as if you just raise them in a cage? So how do you design a citizen science protocol that is still fun for the citizens, but for the people doing it, but is contributing to the science as well? And then I want to end by just asking a bunch of thought questions about how can we do better in terms of thinking about compensation that people get for participation. Because, you know, Rose asked this question of, is it enough to think about just having fun or adding more purpose to a hobby? Is that enough? Maybe sometimes, maybe it's not. How do we give back some of the status of gaining knowledge through that? You know, thinking about the scientists getting credit, but are there better ways to acknowledge involvement of citizen scientists? Are there ways we can incorporate maybe a certificate of participation into someone's resume in terms of professional development? Are there better ways to incorporate fairness or respect? So the scientists, could we have more opportunities for people to offer their observations in order to contribute to the science in the future? And here I'll note, again, with the butterfly example, I'm on a whole bunch of listservs of people that have a lot of non-scientists that contribute observations from their yard. And quite often those are very interesting observations that could actually, you know, open doors into a new study. There just needs to be a mechanism by which those can be delivered to the scientist. And in many ways, natural history and biology is the start of a lot of research questions, and citizen scientists are often the new natural historians. So I will end there. I think that was right about 10 minutes, and I'm very interested in the questions and the discussions. So thank you, Rose, for a very stimulating talk.
Thank you, Emily. So as I'm turning the things back over to Rose for her to respond briefly to Emily, let me highlight to those in attendance that we will be transitioning to the Q&A time. There are 3 different ways to ask questions. You can use the raise hand function, which will allow you to verbally ask your question. You can also use the Q&A panel, which lets you type in the question there. And also you could simply do it in the chat. I will track all 3 and make sure people get a chance to go, and we should have plenty of time for those questions. So Rose, give you a moment for a brief response to Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That was a really, really great commentary. And I fully support everything that you're saying. And I think it's like, I especially appreciate the fact that you brought up the point about like unequal participation and who has actually the means to participate in citizen science when it is demanding in terms of time or other sorts of resources that people might have. And this is a massive issue that obviously affects in interesting ways the question about exploitation, because then often we're not exploiting the kinds of people that are usually the targets of exploitation, like Uber drivers. I mean, they're being exploited in other ways by people that earn money actually off them instead of just getting knowledge. So I think it's an interesting thing to be thinking about. And also, like, definitely, so one of the things I've been thinking about is how like charity and volunteering fit into all of this, because citizen science is ultimately most of the time a form of volunteering, and we wouldn't want to say most of the time that volunteering is exploitative, but I think then there would be certain conditions under which it could be exploitative, and having to do with things like fairness and recognizing the sorts of roles that people are playing and how they're being treated and things like this. So I really like your question, like, is it fair? And then when designing citizen science, thinking about what's being asked of citizen scientists versus what they're getting in return. And obviously this return being much more than just monetary, that there are genuine benefits that people get to just participating in something that that gives it a purpose, like as you said, and that this can often be something that people are really missing in their day-to-day life, whether it's in their work or in their family life, that they're missing this sense of purpose or a greater good, in particular now that religion isn't such a big thing in many people's lives. And it can actually be very empowering as well, this form of participation, especially if it's done in a way in which people do kind of have some agency, that people can get a sense of themselves as actors in a way that's very difficult to, even in a democracy where we are actually voting, for instance, and we are able to be politically active. It's often less of a sense of what our actions are achieving than what we might get in, say, something like citizen science. So yeah, I think it's really important to recognize all of these benefits, and that it extends beyond the epistemic, in fact, in a lot of really important ways. Yeah, so thank you for the commentary. I might have to ask you for your slides as well, because they're really great. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of the questions.
Okay, so now the floor is open for questions. So again, you can use the raise hand function, or you can submit a question in the Q&A button, or you can use the chat, whichever you prefer. I've got a question from Barbella Hani in the question and answer panel, so I'm just going to go ahead and read that one out. Remuneration is indeed necessary in citizen science, I think, but if working with local communities, remuneration can become a source of conflict within the community if not all of the community can get paid, as it is often the case with funded projects from academics. Research with communities is not necessarily the same as citizen science, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts of how to handle remuneration issues in action research with communities.
Yeah, thank you, Charbel, for the question. This is a big one and probably not something that I can address straight away, but it does give me something to think about. So it is true that paying people can have unintended consequences, in particular when not everybody is being paid. And in addition to these concerns about, so you pay some members of the community and then other people get upset because they're not getting the money, and why not, and why wasn't I allowed to participate in things like this. There's also the sort of like potential for then perverse actors to participate in citizen science or in these sorts of participatory projects where they're in it primarily then for the money and not for the other aspects, and it can lead to issues with cheating and kind of making like fabrication and falsification and things like this. And this is an issue in science more generally, in fact, but there's this strong ethos in science that prevents people from engaging in these sorts of let's like malicious actors. But it is a worry that some people have with citizen science, and in particular in certain sorts of marginalized communities where people are really struggling to get by, that if you offer a financial incentive to participate, that then you'll get people who aren't necessarily in it for the science, if we put it this way. So it is something that's not like, it's something that I hadn't actually thought about in connection to this, but it is definitely relevant when considering about addressing issues of exploitation, actually. Yeah.
Great. Further questions? I will go ahead and take the host prerogative and ask a question about the second condition in your discussion of epistemic exploitation in terms of the common characteristics, which was historical injustices, domination, power, and vulnerability. So two things came to mind in thinking about that condition. One is that we might have a question about how far back in time we consider historical injustice, especially given that many different areas of contemporary science have in some ways been built out of those historical injustices. Maybe those things have not occurred in more recent time, but some of them maybe didn't occur that long ago, but in many cases they did occur at some deep node in the development of the science. And then related to that, and maybe this picks up on the last question too about vulnerability, because a number of the things that Emily highlighted about sort of things that individuals do for, say, fun or as sort of avocations depends a lot on like the standard of wealth in your culture and the sort of ability to have free time to be able to engage in those things. So, I mean, is it the case that this will mean that citizen science is unlikely to be something that can be utilized in particular parts of the world, where those conditions might simply not be possible because of those, say, vulnerability criteria or something like that?
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for the question. So it's a good one, and good to be pressing me on this point. So I think I would say in response to this, so like how far back in time does it go? I think pretty far. I think these sorts of injustices that science has been involved in and continues to be involved in. I mean, how long has professional science been around? Not all that long in the grand scheme of things. And so this like not long enough that I think we could think about a kind of a science that's gotten over its past in that respect. So I think we're always going to have to consider the fact that it's been imbricated in domination of certain communities and oppression of certain communities in the past, and in the not too distant past, in fact. But in terms of thinking about what this implies for, and similarly with the issue of the fact that there are like many vulnerable communities out there, what this implies for citizen science is, I think, less that we just shouldn't be doing citizen science in those places, because I think because there are so many benefits to citizen science, although it is important to think about like what is appropriate for certain sorts of communities, and maybe citizen science isn't appropriate for some communities that other forms of participatory research would be more appropriate, and more, say, empowering and relevant for the communities. But say, looking at a country like India, which has been subject to colonization and that has had lots of very problematic interactions with scientists, professional scientists in the past, lots of kind of extractivist research. I think citizen science can take place there, but it's a matter of how that's done and how it's ensured that it's structured in a way that these sorts of differences between scientists and kind of other sorts of people in the world, other subjects, often people who've been colonized, how they can be kind of worked against through citizen science projects. And there are examples of these kinds of more liberating or liberatory approaches. And I think even projects that aren't intending to do this sometimes do end up doing this, and you see this sometimes. So eBirds are quite an interesting case. I've been looking at eBird in India in particular, where although you still have this kind of colonial relation of the US, of what kind of a dominant Western power kind of extracting data out of India, you also get a lot of local scientists using this platform and adapting it for their own purposes, and also local bird watchers, including like using it for studying local bird life in ways that hadn't been possible before. And so you get this kind of disruption of classical colonial structures. So I think there's a lot of potential there for citizen science to do these sorts of things but it requires some kinds of not just going in there and trying to get people to do the work for you and then getting out again, basically.
Okay, thanks. So we've got some questions in the queue here. I'll just start working through them. From Rob Wallace: how exactly do the epistemic stakes change across transdisciplinary topics, say butterflies versus a pandemic response, where the former is fun for non-Indigenous groups versus a matter of life and death for the other?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add here, this kind of is related to what Rose was just talking about, that I don't think you can't really have fun if you're not safe. And if you're in a life or death situation or you feel under threat, I mean, those are not really the conditions under which you can have fun, which is generally related to learning and dealing with kind of something that's a small challenge, but not so stressful that it's not fun. And I guess so what is fun is going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on the environment. And so I think, and maybe this relates to another question, thinking about how the incentives are going to vary with the situation. I don't know if you want to add to that, Rose.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, and it is. I mean, it is true that these sorts of things, like thinking about whether something counts as exploitation, for instance, or thinking about whether citizen science is the right approach, this is going to really depend on the specific case at hand. And so there's a reason why citizen science is quite common in fields like ecology, where kind of people enjoy being outdoors. Well, not everybody, but lots of people enjoy being outdoors and learning about nature and things like this. But also there's a reason why it's common in areas like, weirdly enough, protein biology, where people get really interested in going and analyzing protein structures online, these sorts of things, or astronomy. So there are lots of fields where people actually do enjoy this. And obviously there's some where it can be dangerous to be involved in the research. And that's where, I mean, that's where general ethical considerations about research come into play as well, about what's safe, as Emily said, for participants, and also what's kind of what's something that we can trust citizen science with in terms of burdening them with a great responsibility as well.
Okay, go to the next question from Ron Okagaki. Is the cost of not participating relevant here? Is a comparison with sweatshops fair?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That's a great question. So I think it's interesting. So with sweatshops, there's not typically a cost of not participating. There's just the kind of crappy life that you're left in if you don't work in a sweatshop. So it's not like somebody's going to be punishing you if you aren't participating, if you don't join a sweatshop. Obviously, then once you are employed there, they might punish you for trying to leave. And this does happen, but usually the comparison is between like choosing to be employed there versus not choosing to be employed there. What is true, though, is, of course, it's not like most people are sitting around and being like, oh, what I really need in my life is some science. And oh, I just can't seem to get it anywhere. And the only way I can get it is to join this citizen science project. That's not really kind of a particularly good description of what's going on. But I think it's almost like that for some people, that some people, like, they would have liked to have become scientists in their lives, but for whatever reason they ended up as IT professionals or doctors or working in business or advertising or whatever it is. And these are white collar workers, and you can see why, because these are the people with the means to participate in citizen science. But these people, then they might say, okay, like, I would have liked to have been involved more in science and I wasn't, but this seems like a good way for me to do it. Maybe I've been to a museum and I've seen that there's this citizen science project that they're doing. I like going to the museum because I like science. I find out about that. Oh, that seems like a good, easy way for me to get involved in this, that kind of satisfies that need that I have. I don't think it describes everybody, but I think we could talk about the idea that there's like a kind of a need that people have, an unfulfilled need that some people have in their lives to engage with science, and that citizen science is something that people go to satisfy that need. Yeah, but it's an interesting question.
Okay, next question comes from Shireen. Do you think that some worries about exploitation due to lack of informed consent could be resolved with guarantees about how people's data can be used or cannot be misused?
Sorry, Alan, can you say that again?
I can read it again. Yep.
Yeah.
Do you think that some worries about exploitation due to lack of informed consent could be resolved with guarantees about how people's data can be used or cannot be misused?
Hmm. Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think that's definitely part of what should be happening at any rate. in a citizen science project. I mean, this is true of any sort of research that involves human participants, whether it's citizen science or kind of medical research or whatever. There should be clear and transparent information about how data is being used. And I think this probably varies from context to context, how much this sort of information is being provided to people, hence the discussions around misinformation. And I think it's also the case that sometimes people say they will do one thing and don't kind of realize exactly how the citizen science project will turn out, when it's actually happening. And so then the information that they had provided at the beginning isn't necessarily what ends up like being the case in the project. But certainly there needs to be like proper regulation of things like the use of sharing of personal data and things like this. That said, it's very difficult often to communicate these sorts of issues to participants. Say, if you're participating in a lot of these citizen science projects, your IP address and your location will be linked, like using your phone and going and taking a photo somewhere. And you can get huge amounts of data about a particular individual and where they've been and kind of maybe sometimes who they're with and things like this from this data. And it's hard sometimes to communicate that to people that's the sort of data that's being shared through their participation. Even if you write that, they might not fully know what that means. So I mean, this might be changing now because people are becoming much more data savvy, especially in the last 5 years or so. But like, yeah, it is tricky, but definitely it can help to address the issue of coercion in citizen science.
Maybe I could add, I do feel like with some of the crowdsourced data and instances where the data then become publicly available, there are guarantees you can give for one study, but it's somewhat impossible to say what's going to happen to it once it's publicly available, because other people will probably come up with new questions and reanalyze the data in some way. And I think and this is also true with things like iNaturalist or eBird, where you might post something about one species being like, oh, this is cool that I saw it, and then 500 people go to see it. And so there are ways that those platforms will obscure information for rare species, which is good. But there's still ways that it can be used that you don't anticipate.
Okay, let's move to another question from James. How might intellectual property relate to citizen contributors versus corporate, say in terms of patents or copyrights, or academia in terms of academic integrity, plagiarism, proper crediting, and citation and research writing?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I'm not going to be able to say a huge amount about it because I'm not super au fait with the legal side of IP. But in terms of thinking about citizen science, so often, as Emily just pointed out, often the kinds of contributions of citizen scientists are going into the public domain. So they're not, but not always. Sometimes the copyright is retained with the person who produced the data. So this is the case with eBird data, for instance. The lists go into the public data set, into the public domain, but the photographs people take and the sound recordings that they make, they retain copyright. And this has been interestingly controversial for some participants in eBird. So I know in India, there's a strong open source and open tech kind of open science, open access movement, and like broad acceptance of and like desire to engage more in open practices. And yes, things like Wikipedia are very big there, things like this. And Indian contributors to eBird, not all of them, but some of them really want to not have to have copyright of the images that they submit to eBird or the sound recordings that they make. But Cornell Lab of Ornithology hasn't yet implemented a way for them to be able to license it under, say, a Creative Commons license, like Wikipedia is licensed under Wikimedia. So it's not like it's hard to provide just a single answer for this, I guess, is the thing. It doesn't go without saying that we should provide all citizen scientists with copyright or IP over their contributions, because they might not want that and might not be what is kind of feasible for the project. And it might not be what kind of benefits the community and also then the participants themselves. But it's something that needs to be considered in particular cases, and also then alternative forms of crediting or attribution that and ownership, other than these kind of more legalistic and wholesale approaches to attributing ownership and authorship.
Okay, I'm going to blend two questions here because they touch on something similar. So Vivek asked, what if we give a kind of non-monetary incentives platter? It's a platter that they can choose from. The components can range from modules of capacity building, career guidance, consultation, and others. Obviously, we could broaden that out. And I think the relationship is very close to something Charbel put in the comments. Remuneration may be a restrictive concept when we think of returns to citizen scientists or communities. And is there a possibility of even co-constructing the sort of incentives and the sort of, I guess, what would be on the platter for individuals participating?
Yeah, these are both great suggestions. And I would probably just say, like, probably. So I think it's a nice idea to offer people a choice in terms of what they want to get out of participation. This also then could be nicely joined with a better choice about what sort of participation they want to engage in. So like more options in terms of how they're participating. And obviously then this would go hand in hand with talking to potential participants or existing participants about what it is that they're already getting out of their participation, and also what they'd like to get out of it, what they feel like they need to get out of it. And to a large extent, this is happening in citizen science projects, where you have a lot of people then speaking to participants and asking them like, why did you choose to come here? What are your motivations for coming here? What are you getting out of it? Like, what would you like to have been different? These sorts of things. But it could maybe thinking about it in terms of remuneration or reward or kind of benefits, like a fair distribution of benefits. But this might change the way this is framed, and less, because there's a tendency in these sorts of studies to focus on like trying to get more people to participate, and less thinking about what would it be for that participation to be fair. So and I think that might change things in terms of what sort of benefits are considered to be the ones that you need to design a project around. Like thinking less in terms of recruiting more participants and thinking more in terms of providing participants with things that they feel like they need, and that also, like, for reasons of fairness, they should be allowed to receive, I guess, the participation.
Okay, so I think we'll take one last question. It comes from Rob Wallace again. How does citizens science differ from science for the people and movement science?
Yeah, this is a good question. So as Emily's comment already hinted at, there's like different ways to understand what citizen science is, and there's also various different ways in which members of the public do science, with or without professional scientists, including science for the people and the other thing that just disappeared from the screen, movement science. And there's other things like DIY science. So Emily mentioned kind of community-based science. There's a whole range of activities, and sometimes citizen science is used as a term to cover all of those things, and sometimes it's used more specifically to talk about the contributory or crowdsourcing mode that I mentioned. Basically, things get super complicated, but historically they have a slightly different origin. If that's kind of like a cheap answer, but yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Rose, and thank you, Emily, for presentation, commentary, and responses to questions. It was a great session. Thank you all who joined us and for your questions. Just want to remind folks that our next installment will be in November. So join us on November 19th for Interspecific Social Relationships, Kinship, and Environmental Care. More details online at our website. And with that, I'll bring everything to a close and say thank you and take care. Bye-bye.